Welcome back to the respiratory system, and we are going to focus in this video on what is our stimulus to breathe, what are the reasons on why we actually breathe, and then take a look at some of the challenges of our respiratory system while we are exercising. But first, before we get started, I want to do a quick 5-minute rewind. I want you to right now take a moment, pause the video, look at these questions here, and try to answer them before moving on. If you are not ready and have these answers, I'd highly suggest going back and watching the first video where we go over the general overview and anatomy of the respiratory system. So, can you name all the structures that air passes through from the outside world to the alveoli? Also, what are the three functions of the upper airway system? And what is the main function of our lower respiratory system? So, answer these questions before moving on. All right, so let's talk about why it is that we breathe. What is our stimulus to breathe? And I want to tell you a story about the lonely toilet. Have you ever been walking in your home, walked past the bathroom, haven't gone to the bathroom for a while, looked in at your toilet and said, you know, I don't really need to go to the bathroom right now, but I think that my toilet is lonely. I think I need to go in and flush it just so we can have something to do. And you walk in without going to the bathroom, flush the toilet, and walk back out. Have you ever done this in your life? No, of course you haven't, because that would be silly. What is the reason on why we actually flush our toilets? That's right, to be able to get rid of waste. Our lungs are the exact same way. The reason why we will exhale is because we have a buildup of waste in our lungs and we need to get rid of it. If we don't have this buildup of waste, then we will not end up exhaling air because we don't have to get rid of anything. So, how do we know what this race is, what this waste is? Well, it's all being sensed by what we call our chemoreceptors. So, our chemoreceptors, we have two different kinds. We have the level within the brain, which is sensing the level of carbon dioxide. More technically, it's actually taking a look at our hydrogen ion levels in the medulla oblongata. But for right now, we're going to focus on that. It's basically a equivalent of carbon dioxide buildup that's happening within the bloodstream. And it is being sensed in the medulla oblongata that's located within our brainstem. We also have a system that is of chemoreceptors that's located in the carotid bodies, which is located right at your carotid artery in your neck as the juncture between your internal and external carotid arteries. And this actually, instead of sensing carbon dioxide, is looking at our level of oxygen. We also can have we also have these same chemoreceptors located in our aortic arch, which is coming right off of our aorta as it's leaving the heart itself. So, we're going to go over these different firing patterns and what is happening here. So, in our medulla oblongata, we have what are called central chemoreceptors. And these central chemoreceptors are responding to levels of carbon dioxide, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide located. It's actually reading it through what's called our hydrogen ions. And I'm going to introduce that to you in just a second. But right now, think of it as our level of carbon dioxide. These are traveling to send messages up to the respiratory center that says when there are high levels, we need to exhale to get rid of some of these byproducts of our metabolism. We have a backup system that's located here in the aortic arch and also in the carotid bodies right here in our neck that is taking a look at levels of oxygen. And whenever our levels of oxygen drop too low, then it is also a stimulus for us to be able to breathe. It makes it so that we will exhale our air and then, by happenstance, take in fresh, clean air afterwards to be able to get more oxygen into the system. But think of this peripheral chemoreceptor system as our backup system, and our central chemoreceptors, located in the medulla oblongata, as our main source of why we breathe. So the central chemoreceptors, located in the medulla oblongata, they actually respond to the level of our acidicness in our blood, our pH levels, which really is driven by our hydrogen ions. So it has hydrogen ions in all of the fluid that's nearby these central chemoreceptors, and it's sensing how many are building up within the fluid of our bodies. The interstitial fluid is near equilibrium in our cerebral spinal fluid. So we can see when there's like changes as it's moving through these different structures. Hydrogen ions cannot actually diffuse across the blood brain barrier, though, but carbon dioxide can. So we have to do this conversion between carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions to be able to move these signals and these levels around in our body. And this is through what's called our bicarbonate equation. And we're looking at the role of carbonic anhydrase in it. So when we are having cellular respiration, as a byproduct, we are producing carbon dioxide. Whenever there is carbon dioxide in the area and there is water nearby, these two chemicals will bind together to become what's called carbonic acid. This carbonic acid is a very unstable molecule. So it immediately is acted on by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, which will divide it into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So now my CO2 levels through all of my metabolism have now converted into hydrogen ions. And these hydrogen ions can flow around within the bloodstream, as well as carbon dioxide still flowing around in the bloodstream as well. But when it gets up into the brain, it can't transfer across the blood brain barrier. So, what that means is that we have to take these hydrogen ions and to be able to turn them in to carbon dioxide again to be able to get this level of carbon dioxide across the blood brain barrier. So the hydrogen ions will bind to located nearby bicarbonate molecules, which will then transform into carbonic acid, which is a very unstable molecule. So then it will divide into water and carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide can now diffuse across the blood brain barrier. After it gets to the other side, then it can convert from carbon dioxide back into hydrogen ions to be able to be read in the medulla oblongata, showing that we have changes in our pH by having more hydrogen ions present. So I'm going to show you a picture of what this looks like to help maybe place it in a little bit more context. So we have carbon dioxide that's floating around within the blood, right? And hydrogen ions as well. Hydrogen ions, though, cannot cross the blood brain barrier. So instead, what happens, these hydrogen ions will bind to bicarbonate that's located in the system, form into carbonic acid, and then divide into water and carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide now can cross the blood brain barrier. So carbon dioxide moves across into our cerebral spinal fluid, the fluid that is located around our brain and around our spinal column. It's full of fluid because it is a fluid, right? This fluid and carbon dioxide bind together, and through carbonic anhydrase will create this carbonic acid. This carbonic acid, though, remember, is highly unstable. So it now breaks off into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. These hydrogen ions now can travel to the medulla oblongata, which is where our central chemoreceptors are, which now are reading the level of hydrogen ions in this fluid. When it senses that there are elevated levels of hydrogen ions, it is our stimulus to exhale. And this is when expiration takes place. So let's take a look at our hemoglobin and our red blood cells and our oxygen. So, hemoglobin, to maintain the normal quantities of our red blood cells, new blood cells have to enter our circulation at the rate of at least 2 million per second. I'm going to repeat that again because that is so much. So, we have new red blood cells entering circulation at the rate of at least 2 million per second. And that's because constantly red blood cells are dying off every single time we are creating movement or walking or just through age, because they only live for approximately 120 days. So, this assures that we can have this constant balance between the production of our red blood cells and the destruction of them. In our healthy male, we have about 5.4 million red blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood, right? So that's a lot of red blood cells. In the female, it's a little bit less. We have about 4.8 million red blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood. Males tend to be higher because of the level of testosterone in their body, which actually stimulates the creation of erythropoietin, which is what it leads to our production of red blood cells. Now we have on each red blood cell about 280 million hemoglobin. So if we can only take, I can't do this math, but maybe you can, where you take 280 million hemoglobin per one red blood cell, and then on average about 5 or so million red blood cells per cubic millimeters of blood, in which we have about 5 liters of blood in our body. That is astronomical, the number of red blood cells that we have. So, why are hemoglobin important? Well, we're going to take a look at it because it's often how oxygen is carried in the blood. About 97% of the oxygen that's being transported around in our bloodstream is bound to hemoglobin. So it actually binds onto there. There is a small amount, about that 3%, that is dissolved into the plasma itself, but most of it is bound to the hemoglobin. Well, how does hemoglobin carry oxygen? Well, it carries on it, hemoglobin has 4 oxygen molecules that can bind to it, and they actually bind to iron molecules. So there are iron molecules, 4 of them, on each hemoglobin, and that's where oxygen can bind to. Each site is affected by the other 3, meaning if oxygen starts to bind onto these iron molecules, what will end up happening is that it makes it a higher affinity for more oxygen to be able to bind to the other 3 iron molecules. And the reverse goes the same. If one of the oxygen molecules goes to leave the hemoglobin, it is a higher affinity for us to push the other oxygen off of the other iron molecules. So when we're binding it onto it, the more they bind, the easier it becomes for the others to be able to bind. Now let's take a look at our hemoglobin and carbon dioxide. So how is carbon dioxide carried in the blood? Well, some of it is dissolved in the plasma, about 7 to 10% of it. Some of it is bound to hemoglobin, which is about 23% of it, but most of it is actually converted to bicarbonate within the bloodstream, and that's about 70% of what we're seeing as far as the transportation of carbon dioxide.
Into how does exercise actually challenge the respiratory system? So what are the changes that we're going to see when we are starting to exercise with our respiratory system? Well, we talked about how really we are producing so many waste products and so much carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions as well. But what's happening then is that we have so much carbon dioxide being produced. We go from about 3 milliliters per kilogram per minute being produced to upwards of 50 to 100 milliliters per kilogram, which really is going from about 200 or 250 milliliters to upwards of 4 to 7 liters per minute. That's a huge amount. So how do we get rid of this? Is by breathing more, right? So we change our ventilation with our exercise. So here in the green line, you can see light exercise, how our ventilation increases and then drops back down after we finish exercising. Moderate, you'll see that ventilation increase even more, and then heavy is even more above that. So just looking at how high we can get with our ventilations, maximum ventilations is usually around 200. So something just to take a look at. Now, when we start exercising, an increase in our workload, we'll see a linear relationship, right? A linear relationship of what's being produced. And then all of a sudden, we'll hit a time period in which our ventilation exponentially increases. This is the time period called the ventilatory threshold. Essentially, we are progressing appropriately to match how much CO2 is being produced with how much we are breathing. But we hit a time period in which all of a sudden, even though CO2 production might be steadily increasing, we get an exponential rise in how much we are actually breathing. So we will actually move into hyperventilation at this time period. Many of us have felt this before, right? You're exercising, you're feeling fine, and then all of a sudden you up it just a little bit, and all of a sudden you feel like you can't catch your breath no matter what. But if you were right below that level, you were still breathing normally. What is it about that time period? Well, that's the time period in which we can no longer match these two of the carbon dioxide being produced and how much we're breathing. This also happens to coincide with what we consider our lactate threshold. We don't call it that at this time period because we're not measuring lactate. We are measuring just ventilations through this, but they tend to happen right around the same time period, which is when we are moving from our oxidative system into our anaerobic system. All right, so how else does exercise challenge the respiratory system? Well, our second challenge that we can see is that as we start increasing in our ventilations, remember that takes muscle, right? We use our diaphragm, we use our intercostal muscles in order to inspire. And that actually will increase the work of the muscles that we are using to breathe. And it actually increases the work of breathing. So then what we need to try and figure out is how the respiratory system can actually minimize this work of breathing in order to not pull oxygen away from the working muscle to go towards our breathing. So let's just take a look at a couple of graphs really quickly. When we start exercising at higher levels, we can use more than 15% of our total oxygen consumed during heavy exercise just for the contraction of our inspiratory muscles in order to be breathing. Essentially, at this time period, we are stealing oxygen from our other working muscles like our legs or our arms or whatever we're using and diverting that to the muscles of inspiration. And so we call it respiratory steal, that we are stealing that oxygen away from other things that need to be happening. So we're just looking at respiratory muscles here versus non-respiratory, and as it's coming up, you'll see an increase in your ventilations, and as the increase in the ventilations is getting larger and larger, all of a sudden you'll see that this oxygen consumption from the respiratory muscles is getting larger and larger as well. So we're using a higher percentage or a higher amount of oxygen consumption for our respiratory muscles at max exercise or when we're breathing more, compared to when we are breathing less. This is also showing you your ventilations right here. This VE is your ventilations, and as the ventilations are increasing, the oxygen consumption that's required for our breathing is going up further and further and further. And of course, this is going to be taking it from other areas, which our main concern is that it's taking it from our working muscle. So as we increase the work of breathing, the blood flow to the legs is going to go down, right? It's an inverse relationship. As I decrease the work of breathing, we'll be able to increase blood flow going to the legs. So if I am inspiring more and more and breathing more and more, I need to direct blood flow to those muscles of inspiration, like the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. So my work of breathing is going to take away from that leg blood flow, and that's why we call it that respiratory steal.
So we're going to end here, and then we're going to come back in our next video to actually talk about oxygen consumption and how this all plays a role with our fitness.